It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce my good friend and colleague, Professor Dante Lauretta, Regents Professor at the University of Arizona. He grew up in Arizona in a small town north of Phoenix. He attended the University of Arizona. Then he went to Washington University, St. Louis for postgraduate work to get his PhD, then came to ASU and did some work, and then he came home. So he's been here since 2004? 2001, and in 2004, I believe, he joined the team for the OSIRIS-REx mission, which was headed by Michael Drake. And in 2011, they got a $1 billion grant, is that right? And sometime shortly after, unfortunately, tragically, Michael passed away, and Dante was named as his successor, and he's directed this for the past 20 years or so, and he's going to tell you about it. It's amazing. Please welcome Dante Lauretta.
All right, thank you, Stuart. It is my great pleasure to be here today. And I'm going to take you on a journey that began 4.5 billion years ago and ended with us sitting in this room pondering the deepest questions that face us. Where did we come from? What's our destiny? And why is a lump of matter sitting here talking to you and asking these questions? And it's characterized by the OSIRIS-REx Asteroid Sample Return Mission. This is a NASA program in the Planetary Science Division to send a robotic vehicle, as you can see on the title slide here, to a near-Earth asteroid, survey it, catch a sample, deliver it back to the Earth to address these fundamental questions. We think this journey started in a giant molecular cloud. You can see this amazing James Webb Space Telescope image of the Carina Nebula. This is a star-forming region. Up off the field of view is a massive star emitting high-energy ultraviolet and X-ray radiation, sculpting the cloud. And you can see it's revealing pillars of high-density material. Inside each one of those, a new planetary system is forming, and we think it looks something like this. This is a protoplanetary disk. As those giant molecular clouds collapse, angular momentum is conserved. Some of the material cannot fall into the central star and, in fact, has to spin out into a disk of material. Inside that disk, chemistry and physics work together to build planetary systems. Towards the end of that process, the proto-sun ignites, beginning the nuclear fusion that's been powering life on Earth for over 4 billion years. Material is colliding onto the early Earth, which accreted in the inner disk. The surface is intense. It's full of volcanic activity. Asteroids are raining down. We think, in fact, the entire surface of the planet was molten, a magma ocean. We call this period the Hadean, hot, hellish, inhospitable to life. No water, no atmosphere, no life. So the real question that we're addressing is, how did our planet go from this state to the beautiful paradise that we enjoy today with our rich biosphere, our technology, our civilization, and the rich conscious experience that some humans enjoy? So we can ask ourselves, when did life on Earth emerge? From the timeline of the early solar system formation, we can define a habitability boundary, at least for life as we know it. And it's still amazing to me, with all of these technological advancements, James Webb, Kepler finding thousands of extrasolar planets, we still don't have any even good hints that there is another planet that has life on its surface. We know that soon after the Earth formed, there was a giant collision. An object the size of Mars crashed into the proto-Earth, spalling off the material that went into orbit to form our moon. And in fact, the moon may be central to habitability because it gives us tides, it gives us rhythms, all biology is kind of synced up. Smaller impacts would continue to occur for about 600 million years. So the moon forming event occurred about 4.5 billion years ago. A little over 3.9 billion years ago, things started to settle down. But we still have the problem of how did it go from a rocky world to something with oceans and an atmosphere, organic molecules, and life. And our leading hypothesis is that some of these late-stage planetesimals, which were raining down upon the surface of the Earth, came from the outer solar system, where it's much colder, and compounds like water, carbon dioxide, ammonia would condense, just like snowflakes, from the gas phase into the solid, forming icy planetesimals that had to make their way into the inner solar system, delivering the key compounds for life as we know it. So in order to test these ideas, we sent a spacecraft to such an object that we postulated represented these planetesimals from the dawn of our solar system. And when we think of asteroids, we usually think of a belt of objects between Mars and Jupiter. And in fact, when we were first conceiving of the mission, we wanted to get out to the main asteroid belt, sample one of the objects and bring it back to the Earth. And we soon realized that that was going to be really challenging. Especially, it was going to take a long time, maybe 20 years, to get out there, get the sample, and come back. And we have a lot of patience in space flight. The OSIRIS-REx program was 7 years of flight. But we really wanted to say, do we have to get out there? And the good news is there's another population of asteroids called near-Earth objects. Bennu, the target of our mission, is one such asteroid. And you can see its orbit on the diagram here. Earth is in blue, Bennu is in orange. You can see Earth is 1 astronomical unit away. Bennu has what we call an elliptical orbit. It comes inside the orbit of Earth, gets a little closer to the sun, and gets almost out to the orbit of Mars. And you might think, well, how can this be an icy planetesimal from the early solar system? I'll tell you about that. But the way I look at it is the main asteroid belt is like the top of the mountain. It's very energetic. And we're lazy geologists, right? We want to know how the mountain formed, but we really don't feel like hiking all the way to the top. So what we're going to do is we're going to poke around in the riverbeds. If you've gotten out to Ventana Canyon and explored the natural beauty of Arizona, you've seen all the rocks that are tumbling down from the top of the Catalina Mountains. And we can poke around in the riverbed and find something that's interesting and say, this might be the clue that we're looking for. Near-Earth asteroids are like the rocks in the riverbed. They're tumbling in from the main asteroid belt, and in fact, maybe even farther out in the solar system through dynamical interactions with sunlight and the giant planets Jupiter and Saturn. The small objects especially are susceptible to these forces, so the near-Earth asteroid population is dominated, thankfully, by much smaller asteroids than we see in the main belt. So by going to a near-Earth object, we can save energy, we can save time, that all translates into money, and we can still address these key fundamental questions. Another characteristic of the orbit that you can see when you look at the lower version of the diagram where we're looking at an oblique view is it crosses the orbit of the Earth directly. This made it very accessible for us because we needed to launch off the surface of the Earth, rendezvous, spend a couple years at the asteroid, collect that sample, and get back to the Earth. And it required relatively low energy. The bad news is it would take a little shift in energy for that asteroid to come right to us. And in fact, Bennu is the most potentially hazardous asteroid in the solar system, has a 0.057% chance of hitting the Earth. And if you want to put it in your calendar, it's September 24th, 2182. So it's a small risk with high consequences. Part of our mission deals with addressing the impact risk. But I'm not going to focus on that today. I'm going to focus on our origins. Here is the object as we saw it revealed to us upon our encounter. It's about 500 meters in diameter. That's about the height of the Empire State Building. I like to think of it as a small mountain in space. If it was sitting right here, it would rise up to about the top of the ridge on the western edge of the Catalina Mountains. Small as asteroids go, but compelling. We chose Bennu for several reasons. You see the orbit, the dynamics, the engineering, those all went into our calculus. But why Bennu rose to the top of the list was its surface properties. It's really dark. It reflects about 4% of the sunlight that strikes its surface. It's darker than coal, darker than asphalt. And we inferred that dark surface meant high abundances of carbon. Dark graphitic or carbonaceous material is very low in reflectance, so we hoped by going to this dark near-Earth asteroid, we would be getting some of this primordial material that may have seeded life on Earth and led to our planet's habitability. It's got this really interesting spherical shape. As we'll see, it kind of behaves in a very fluid-like manner. It was a challenge to map this. This is all real data. We had a LiDAR laser beam that we could sweep across the surface, building up these beautiful topographic maps, overlaying high-resolution imagery. It's got a salt and peppery kind of texture. You'll see there's some bright spots there, so it's not all dark. Those are very compelling, and we'll see some results from the sample explaining what those might be. I spent my sabbatical year in 2015 living in the high bay of the clean room at Lockheed Martin's facility in Littleton, Colorado, watching this amazing spacecraft come into being. This was a dream come true. When I was a kid, I used to work on my car, hanging out with my buddies in the garage, blasting rock music, putting spark plugs in, tuning the engine. It felt kind of like that, except that I had a $400 million spacecraft sitting there instead of a 1976 Plymouth Duster that I used to ride. The spacecraft has some key features. You can see the white nose cone with the orange back shell. That's the sample return capsule. We'll see that in action later on in the presentation. It's a little hard to tell, but there's a robotic arm on the side facing to me. And when we deploy it, it looks like the shot that you can see over there on the left. That is called the TAGSAM, the Touch and Go Sample Acquisition Mechanism. When we were designing the mission, we didn't know what the asteroid's surface properties were going to be like. And we wanted to land. I thought we should land, we should spend some time, take some pictures, pick the rocks that we want to get. And the engineers were like, great, what's the surface cohesion? What's the responsiveness? And we're like, and they're like, well, that's pretty risky. So let's go for a touch and go, kind of like an aircraft pilot on an aircraft carrier, just comes in, makes a quick touch, and then heads back out. The picture on the right, you can see that the sample return capsule is opened up. The robotic arm has articulated. When you look at the bagged device at the end of the arm there, it's a disc about 30 centimeters in diameter. It's an air filter. I like to say it would look right at home on the carburetor of a 57 Chevy. And it's basically the same technology. There's some gas bottles on the forearm. Those are loaded with high-pressure nitrogen gas. So the concept is you bring the spacecraft down to the surface, only that filter touches it. You open one of those bottles and kind of like a leaf blower, just push a bunch of gravel and dust into that filter. The plan was to spend about 5 seconds on the surface of the asteroid, scoop up as much as we could until the gas was exhausted, fire the rocket engines, backing away from the surface of the asteroid. Here's our timeline. Stuart mentioned we started this in 2004 with the first concept that we submitted to NASA, and it bombed. NASA has 4 categories. The coveted category 1, which means they love it, it's scientifically sound, technologically ready to go. We were category 4, which is thanks, but no thanks. We're not even going to tell you why we're rejecting your proposal. But we believed in it, and the team was building, and you could feel the energy and the momentum. And we said, let's go again. We submitted another proposal, 2005. We made it a little farther into what NASA calls Phase A. It's like the championship game. 2 other missions were in competition, and we lost. 2008, a new opportunity came up. We went back in, got to Phase A, got selected in 2011, spent the next 5 years building that spacecraft, getting it to our launch pad, arrived at the asteroid in 2018 after a swing by of the Earth using the gravity field to push us up onto that incline trajectory to the asteroid, collected that sample in October of 2020 during the darkest days of that COVID pandemic, left in May of 2021, and delivered those samples back to Earth last year. This is what we saw when we arrived. It was a real challenge. We had expected a smooth surface. We had an unprecedented astronomical campaign to characterize the surface of the asteroid, and we had convinced ourselves it was going to be a beach. Sand or gravel was going to dominate the surface, and then we saw this rough and rugged and rocky surface with no beach anywhere in sight. And we spent the next year agonizing over small patches of the asteroid surface, working with the engineers to improve the guidance system so we could get into these really tight locales. And we ultimately selected this impact crater. It's about 20 meters in diameter, the size of a small parking lot. And you can see the giant boulder on the eastern edge there. It's about to rotate into the upper right corner. We called that one Mount Doom. It's about the size of a 3-story building. We had to fly right over the top of it, then drop the spacecraft down into that crater. And you can see why we liked it. When you look at the area around, there's full of these giant boulders. But that little patch of material looked really fine-grained. That looked like the beach that we were seeking. So we had to park a spacecraft autonomously that was 200 million miles away from the Earth, literally on the other side of the solar system, and it took 18 minutes to send a signal from our command center to the spacecraft and another one to hear back. It all worked really well. On October 20th of 2020, we sent the spacecraft down for a very gentle contact, and then we sunk in. It was like hitting a pool of water. There was no resistance to the downward motion of the spacecraft. We fired the gas, excavating an enormous crater, over 25 feet in diameter. When I think of that beautiful spacecraft that we lovingly crafted over a year in Colorado, and that this is what we put it through, I'm still terrified. And I still can't believe we survived this. It sank in over 50 centimeters down into the subsurface of the asteroid, the length of my arm. Thank goodness we fired those rocket engines and backed away, because I believe if we hadn't done that, it would have sunk all the way in and disappeared like it hit a pool of quicksand. But it all worked out great. It's a tough spacecraft. It came away unscathed. You can see the solar arrays are folded back up. We call that the Y-wing configuration. There was no dust that was accumulated. We were very power positive. All the radiators were working just fine, dumping the heat from our electronics. So we successfully collected that sample. Here you can see the footage as the filter gets clicked into a capture ring inside the capsule. It's kind of like clicking your boot into a ski. You can see particles are escaping. We did have some challenges there. We put it to bed. We tucked it in, made sure it was nice and secure. Then we severed the gas tubes and the bolts that were connecting the filter to the arm, closed up the clamshell, saying goodnight to TAGSAM. We wouldn't see it for another 2.5 years. Here it is, September 24th, 2023. The limb of the Earth is visible just on the left edge there. That's the capsule as it was released from the spacecraft. We were about 60,000 miles away from the Earth when we detached it, and it was kind of like throwing that perfect spiral touchdown pass into the end zone in American football. It's a dumb capsule. It had no guidance whatsoever. It was really just spin it to stabilize its flight through the atmosphere. From 60,000 miles away, we targeted a small patch of the Utah desert where we were waiting to recover this precious treasure from outer space. And thank goodness it all worked. There were some heart-pounding moments. The parachute deployed about 3 minutes late. I was in a helicopter flying out to be part of the recovery team, and I thought we were going to fumble it out of the end zone right as we were about to win the championship game. But it all worked. Redundancy and margin saved us. That parachute came down. This is the best footage we have. It unfortunately lands just on the other side of this ridge, but you can see the parachute deflate, indicating that we had a safe touchdown. Thank you. And you probably can only imagine the stress that was released when that moment occurred. It's like we actually did it. When Mike Drake first approached me in 2004 to join him on this great adventure, it sounded like magic. We were talking to Lockheed Martin, and they said, Dante, pick an asteroid, and we'll deliver samples of it back to your laboratory. And I was like, no way, that's even possible. But we did it. We saw the beautiful capsule sitting there. You can see the parachute behind it. We're in one of the salt flats of Utah. It's called the Utah Test and Training Range outside of Salt Lake City. I was fortunate to be on the environmental sampling team, so our job was to make sure the scientific integrity was maintained. Just in case that capsule had popped open or sample had escaped, we wanted to document what was the soil like, what was the air, the dust, even some of the vegetation. We collected it all. It's part of the collection at NASA Johnson Space Center. If there's anything that looks really compelling, because we're going after the origin of life here, and the last thing you want to do is have some profound discovery that turns out to be Utah mud. We put that on a harness on a long line and flew it to a temporary clean room in Utah. And then the Air Force was waiting for us the next morning with this awesome C-17 Globemaster transport jet. We got to the laboratory at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, the same building, Building 31, where the Apollo lunar samples are curated. So we have good neighbors. We got it into our custom-built clean room. Everything has been under nitrogen purge since we retrieved that capsule, so it has not been exposed to the terrestrial atmosphere, and especially to terrestrial biology, because we do have samples of these carbon-rich asteroids in our meteorite collection. But it turns out as soon as they land on Earth, they're immediately colonized and contaminated by bacteria who start munching on the organic compounds that are inside them, probably like their ancestors did 4 billion years ago around the origin of life. Here you can see we're removing the lid from inside the sample return capsule, and this is our first view of TAG-SAM since we tucked it away and put it to bed in 2020. And there's the happy PI celebrating the mission success. We got sample. I got to put my eyes on asteroid Bennu for the first time. All of the imagery had been from cameras, but we saw this beautiful collection of material. Here you can see the TAG-SAM head snapped into its capture ring, and there was these 2 rings of dust surrounding it. As soon as we put it on purge, it kind of pushed all the fine-grained material to the outer edge of the canister. This was great news because we were able to get sample immediately into the laboratories. Within day 3 of sample on Earth, we were in the labs at Johnson Space Center starting to get the first results, trying to understand what this material was made out of. We ultimately extracted over 121 grams of sample. That's more than twice what we promised NASA. The mission requirement was 60 grams. We get access to 25% of it for our scientific studies associated with the mission, and we've been going to town on it there. I didn't go into a lot of details of the mission, but there's 2 books that we've published in the past year. The Bennu 3D is a visual guide to the mission, also covers the history of meteorite and asteroid science, and it's full of stunning 3D views of the asteroid. I worked with my good friend and science team member, Sir Brian May, who's an expert in stereo photography, and him and his collaborator, Claudia Manzoni, meticulously scanned through all of the images we collected, found those perfect stereo pairs where there's just a slight, like 6 or 7 degree offset. With a stereo viewer, you can see the surface pop up in amazing 3D. And The Asteroid Hunter is my story, my view of life and my journey on OSIRIS-REx, and I welcome you to learn more about our program. But let's get into what we really want to talk about today, which is, what does this mean scientifically? Where have we gotten in answering these big questions? After that capsule was closed up and we knew we had sample on its way back to Earth, I actually got to be a scientist again. Most of my life was project management, system engineering, budgeting and schedules, politics and communications. And I'm like, let's go back to what did we promise the agency and the scientific community and ourselves that we would do with these samples? And this sentence always jumps out at me. Analyses of these samples will provide unprecedented knowledge about pre-solar history through the initial stages of planet formation to the origin of life. And I was like, pre-solar history? We know how to do that. There will be pre-solar grains, most likely, grains that formed around dying stars that made it through the giant molecular cloud, survived that protoplanetary disk phase, and we have found those. The initial stages of planet formation, we're going to look at the minerals, we're going to look at the isotopes and the elemental abundances. It's the field of cosmochemistry, it's very well established. But the origin of life, unprecedented knowledge about the origin of life, that's a real challenge that I laid down to this team and to myself in 2010. and I'm dedicated to delivering on that. So I started out as a cosmochemist, like a geochemist, but studying these extraterrestrial samples. And so we like to begin at the elemental abundances, right? And you take a look at the flow chart there, you take a bacteria, and you say, well, okay, what is the bacteria made out of? 70% of it is water. So, okay, is there water in the asteroid? 30% we call the dry solids. If you desiccate the bacterium and you look at what's left, 90% of it are organic molecules: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. The other 10% are mostly phosphorus and sulfur. And you can see other important ions. We've talked a lot of neuroscience here, right? Sodium, calcium, potassium, all have important roles in the brain and in cell functioning. Trace elements are critical for catalytic functions of proteins. All of those elements are important. And so you could be, I could just claim victory and say, well, we're just going to grind up the sample, we're going to analyze these elemental abundances, and we're going to say, there it is. Yeah, asteroids delivered hydrogen and carbon, and that's the origin of life. Not good enough, right? I already knew all those elements were going to be on the asteroid. I didn't need to go get a sample. These are the most common elements in the whole universe, right? Hydrogen, number 1. Helium, number 2. It doesn't do a whole lot. Number 3, number 4, number 5, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. So where do we go? I went to this framework. You start out with the materialistic scientific view, which says that you start out with an inanimate matter, things that are clearly not alive. Most likely going to be basic molecules. Everything almost bonds with hydrogen, so oxygen and hydrogen make water. Nitrogen and hydrogen make ammonia. Carbon and hydrogen make methane. Sulfur and hydrogen make hydrogen sulfide. Phosphorus is always the different one. It's probably not going to be in hydrides. It's going to be in its phosphates. And then the idea is somehow chemistry happens, and you start to make prebiotic molecules. Things like the nucleobases, the letters of the genetic code. Amino acids, the components of our proteins, and lipids, which form cell membranes, creating that critical step in life, compartmentalization, separating an organism from its environment. We've heard a lot about that in this conference. That's what we are, right? We are inside our minds, we have our bodies, and we experience the external environment through our senses. You think that maybe there's a reality out there that's consistent. Your mind has models of how it should work. You're making predictions, and those predictions are usually pretty good. And then somehow those prebiotic molecules polymerize. Nucleobases join up with sugars and phosphates and link into big chains called nucleic acids, which are our genes. Amino acids polymerize, make proteins, which fold up, grab some of those transition metals, do structural, they do catalysis, they are ion gates, basically the workhorses of the cell. And of course, those membranes, which encapsulate it all, separating those components from their environment, becoming a cell, something that's alive. This is really a profound idea, right? It's like, okay, it seems pretty straightforward. We've got a huge biotech industry. We can manipulate life at the atomic level, at the nucleobase level. We can synthesize any protein you can imagine. You can even make new proteins with new amino acids that are not used in biology, in the synthetic biology realm. Why haven't we figured this out? The Miller-Urey experiment was mentioned a couple times yesterday. We've known for 70 years, yeah, you can take these basic molecules, you can zap them with lightning, and you'll make these prebiotic molecules. We haven't gone past that in the whole time we've been trying to understand the origin of life. Part of it is because it's just like consciousness, origin of life has been kind of taboo, especially if you're in the biochemical, biomolecular biology realm. You got to be solving cancer or you're not going to get any funding to move these things forward, right? And there's this taint of the origin of life. It's like, why would you even want to study that? And I'm like, why not would you want to study that? I think the team that cracks the origin of life has unlocked knowledge more powerful than the Manhattan Project. But we're still struggling with this, which is how I connected with Stuart and this consciousness crowd. My colleagues would say I've been corrupted. So let's just take a look. Let's go with the materialistic viewpoint and answer the fundamental questions. Did these asteroids deliver the building blocks of life? Let's start with our water. Loaded with water, right? The bulk hydrogen content of the samples is about 1% by weight. If that's in water, that means 8% by weight, 8 or 9% by weight of the sample is water. This isn't liquid water. This isn't ice crystals. None of that would be stable on this small asteroid. It's locked up in clay minerals, and you can see a couple beautiful examples of them. We have smectites that look like the rosette on the top image there. Serpentines, they're kind of like asbestiform fibers. Serpentine because they make these kind of snake-like crystalline forms. They're not regular crystal structures that are there. On Earth, these minerals form at hydrothermal vents on the mid-ocean floor. They form through hydration and alteration of rocks that are rising up from the mantle of the Earth, anhydrous silicates like olivines, better known as peridot when it's a gemstone. It's influenced by temperature, pressure, and particularly interesting, it has to be carbonated waters, soda waters, CO2-rich fluids that are integral in the production of these serpentines. And we're also going to see hydrogen is an integral component of the wide array of organic molecules that we're seeing there. So in terms of Earth as a habitable world, and we think habitability and water are intimately linked, this asteroid and its brethren, which were formed 4.5 billion years ago, look like good candidates for the kind of material that would have delivered this to the Earth, making it this wonderful ocean world that we see today. But oceans don't equal life necessarily. Let's take a look at the next one, the ammonia. Bennu samples are loaded in nitrogen compared to all other extraterrestrial materials. It's about 1/4 of a weight percent. It's 12 times that of the Murchison meteorite. This is a very famous meteorite, fell in Australia in 1969. It's kind of been the gold standard for organic cosmochemistry. So it's really exciting that Bennu seems to be particularly enriched in nitrogen because this is one of the lower abundance elements. Oxygen and carbon are much more abundant than nitrogen. And so we've got a good source of ammonia. In fact, we have molecular ammonia that we've been able to extract from the sample. You can see there it's about 231 parts per million of the sample is ammonia. So there's a lot of other nitrogen that's in different compounds. It's a very complex, diverse mix of compounds. We look at the isotopes. There's a heavy isotope of nitrogen, nitrogen 15, and the common isotope 14. And we can use those ratios to say, if it's really enriched in nitrogen 15, it had to form in cold temperatures like that interstellar medium, that James Webb Telescope image that I showed you. And then as you get to more normal isotope ratios, it was homogenized in the protoplanetary disk. And as we'll see, Bennu is a small fragment of a much larger asteroid that we call its parent. What about the hydrocarbons? Well, we don't have the methane. At least we haven't detected it yet. But the hydrocarbons are really abundant in the sample. What we did, this was one of the first things we analyzed when we had that sample in Houston. This is coming from a laboratory at Johnson Space Center. We just took a tiny little grain, a couple hundred microns in diameter, and we crushed it onto a flat plate, and we stuck it into a vacuum chamber that had a mass spectrometer attached to it. A mass spectrometer is a scientific instrument that measures the mass of the molecules that you're sending down the analytical pathway. Normally, we have a couple lasers. You can see the technique is called micro L2 MS. There's a first laser which tries to desorb the molecules, and then a second laser hits it to ionize it, and then you can send it into the mass spectrometer to determine the mass. We also have some UV spectroscopy, so we can get a different identification, and we also can characterize it in some cases with gas chromatography, although not for these analyses here. But what we saw right away is as soon as we put the Bennu samples into the vacuum chamber, all of these compounds were outgassing. So we didn't even need the lasers to remove the organic material. It was smelling probably pretty sweet. These are aromatic polycyclic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. And you can see we've got double benzene rings, triple benzene rings, quadruple benzene rings. It looks very primitive in the sense that if you heat these things, you start to drive them farther and farther to the right-hand side there, more kind of tar-like substances. So immediately we knew Bennu is loaded in hydrocarbons. And then when we sweep the laser across, we see the same profile, so you can encourage more of these molecules to leave. They're probably absorbed on those clay minerals, which have very high surface areas. We also have lots of solid carbon. The total carbon content is up to 4.7% by weight of these samples is in carbon. That's the highest abundance of any extraterrestrial material that has been analyzed. It's in various forms. We saw those PAHs, but we see these organic carbons. I've kind of outlined a vein of carbonaceous material that's running through the sample on the upper left. The one right beneath it, that dark material that's surrounding the fine-grained minerals and in between the minerals is like an aggregate. It looks like it's almost holding some of the small minerals together. So those are really reduced forms of carbon in the chemical sense. Hydrocarbons, and a lot of our work moving forward is the detailed characterization of the organics. But there's also carbon in minerals. Carbonates, if you live in an area with hard water, you're very familiar with these. This is the white, crusty material that forms around your faucets when the water evaporates. You've got carbonated water, and when the water leaves, the carbonate grabs whatever ions are in the water and forms these minerals. We're seeing calcium carbonates. Those are used, for example, by marine organisms to make their shells. We're seeing magnesium carbonates, and interestingly, really manganese-rich carbonates, unlike anything we've seen in meteorites before. This is going to be really interesting because there was a radioactive isotope of manganese present in the early solar system, and we'll be able to date the formation of these carbonates using an isotope system, a geochronology system. So this means you've got, those are very oxidized forms of carbon. So reduced and oxidized, those are not in equilibrium necessarily. So this tells you right away there's a lot of complex chemistry going on here. Those carbonates had to form just like they do around your faucets or taps, if you're from the UK, through evaporation. You have water and you have these ions in solution, the carbonate ions, the calcium ions, and as the water leaves the system, the salts form and precipitate behind. So this is pretty exciting. We've got the phyllosilicates, or those clay minerals that look like they formed in the presence of carbonated fluids, and now we have the carbonated minerals that would have precipitated as those fluids dissipated. So we've got all this potential for really complex interaction between organic compounds and mineral phases. What about the sulfides? Well, we don't have the hydrogen sulfide, but you wouldn't expect that. At reasonably high temperatures, hydrogen sulfide will react with metals and form sulfide minerals, particularly iron and nickel sulfides. And so we see that, sulfide minerals. We also see it in organic molecules. I'll show you a little bit about that later on. The sulfides have these beautiful crystal forms. Look at that mineral in the upper diagram there. It's almost like a perfect little hexagon. That tells you something really important about its formation. That means it was growing in an environment that was unrestricted volumetrically, also indicating precipitation from a fluid. If it was surrounded by other rocks, the sulfides would kind of penetrate the cracks and crevices in between them, and we see that in certain meteorite types. These are really interesting, not only because it's important to get sulfur into organic molecules. Sulfur plays a key role in our proteins. It forms the bridges that provide structural stability. But these minerals are particularly efficient catalysts for other organic molecules, including amino acid formation. So as you're growing these platelets of sulfide minerals, the organic rich fluids could be coming by and new compounds can form in a much more rapid way than they would if the mineral wasn't present. That's what we call a catalyst. And then we get to the phosphates, and boy, is this exciting. I was really thrilled. So we found those carbonates when we were scanning the surface of the asteroid. They looked really abundant. We saw white minerals forming veins, sometimes a meter thick and a meter long and 10 centimeters thick. And I thought for sure this was one of the first particles we got here at the University of Arizona. You can see it's a little particle. It's about a millimeter across, but we have fantastic microscopes. We can see down literally to the atomic level. And as soon as this one stood out, it was really different, and it reminded me right away of that salt and peppery texture that we saw on the surface of the asteroid. Most of the sample is really dark. It's so dark when I looked at it through the glove box in the curation lab, it looked like holes in the trays that were holding it. The image I showed you was highly stretched. And then these little bright ones shone out, and I was like, okay, we got the carbonates, that's great. And then we analyzed it, and it was a phosphate mineral. And that really surprised us. Normally, phosphates are bonded with calcium. They're pretty common in volcanic systems or magmatic systems. They kind of are the last things to crystallize. And so we expected they would be calcium phosphates, but they're not. They were magnesium-rich phosphates with high abundances of sodium. Really surprising. And we took a spectrum. You can see in the upper right there, we call that a Fourier transform infrared spectra. Basically, you use a library. You have a bunch of different minerals you've already analyzed, and you see the pattern that they form, and then you get a new pattern from an unknown mineral, and you go through your library and you say, does it look like anything we've analyzed before? And we found it was a really great match to this compound called hydrogen phosphate trihydrate. You can see the formula there, loaded with water, hydrogen in there. It looks like, in our case, sodium is substituting for some of that hydrogen that's sitting in between the magnesium and phosphorus. And when you look at what it does, this is a soluble compound. That is, if I want to do this experiment, we haven't done it yet. You take a little grain. If you were to drop this in water, it would be like salt. It would just completely dissolve, and all of these elements would go back into solution. So this is important, right? Phosphate is kind of the limiting nutrient for origin of life. Hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and sulfur are all really abundant. Phosphorus is low in abundance, and I did a lot of early work on phosphorus cosmochemistry for that reason. I was like, if we can figure out how phosphorus got into the system, maybe that'll give us some real clues to the origin of life. And I started looking around. I'd never seen this before. I've been studying meteorites for almost 30 years now, and I'd never seen these phosphates. And I gave this lecture at the American Geophysical Union, and I said, has anybody seen this in their studies? Please come and talk to me. We're trying to figure out the origin of this phase. And I had a colleague come up afterwards, and he said, we just published a paper last year. We were looking at the data from the Cassini spacecraft, which was in orbit around Saturn. And it was flying by a very compelling icy satellite, or moon, called Enceladus. And it took this image. This is the limb of a moon around Saturn. And you can see it's erupting geysers, kind of like Yellowstone, into space. In fact, this is how the E-ring of Saturn is formed. So these particles are flying out into outer space, they crystallize, and they form a ring around the gas giant planet. They detected sodium phosphate particles ejecting from these plumes in Enceladus. I have a diagram from the paper, the Postberg et al. 2023 paper, which looks at the pH, which tells you how acidic or basic the solution is, and then the phosphate concentration. And in order to get enough phosphate in solution to precipitate these minerals, you got to be in the orange box at the top of the diagram there. High concentrations of phosphate in solution, indicating you had a very basic fluid. pHs above 7 are basic, pHs below 7 are acidic. This looks very basic. That's exactly the pH range that we need in order to produce the clay minerals and the carbonates. And the really important thing is the text above there, which says that in order to get that kind of fluid composition, you had to not only incorporate water ice in the protoplanetary disk, but abundant carbon dioxide ice, or what we would call dry ice. So that's giving us some indication. Somehow, Bennu, which is now a near-Earth asteroid, in orbit very similar to that of the Earth, must have formed out in the region around Saturn in the early solar system, and somehow has made its way in. Again, think of the rocks tumbling down the mountain, right? This thing has come a long way to be our neighbor. So we've put together this timeline. This is actually in the Bennu 3D book, which says that you started out billions of years ago. You had dying stars that had been element factories throwing all these freshly synthesized elements out into the cosmos, processing in the interstellar medium, those giant molecular clouds like we saw at the beginning of the presentation. That cloud collapses and forms a protoplanetary disk, and a large object like Enceladus. Enceladus is about 500 kilometers in diameter. Remember, Bennu's 500 meters, so 1,000 times smaller. Probably something similar, maybe a little smaller, a couple hundred kilometers, accreted out in that protoplanetary disk. And then it had to wander in to the inner solar system, into the main asteroid belt region. In addition to synthesizing the elements like carbon and nitrogen and oxygen, the star also produced radioactive isotopes. So you have radioactivity, you have rock, metals, and ices. The system starts to really heat up, and it drives hydrothermal alteration. We think very much like the vents on the ocean floor, where today we're exploring and finding all kinds of interesting organisms. And in the past, there's been speculation these might be key sites for the origin of life on Earth. But Bennu is not a 200-kilometer object. It's 500 meters. What we think happened is probably on the order of 1 billion years ago, another asteroid shattered Bennu's parent into millions of fragments. And they coalesced like droplets after jumping into a pool of water. Little piles of rubble, which then spin up to give you that spherical, what I call spinning top shape. And once you are in a small asteroid like that, sunlight pushes you around quite a lot. It's called the Yarkovsky effect. And that drove Bennu from the main asteroid belt until it hit a resonance with Jupiter. And then, of course, the OSIRIS-REx spacecraft showed up to get the samples and deliver them back to the Earth. Okay, so what about, so we got the elemental. Definitely asteroids like Bennu delivered the fundamental elemental building blocks of life, those basic molecules. But what about the prebiotic molecules? Let's start out with the letters of our genetic code, right? Life uses 5 different versions of these, 4 in DNA, 3 of those are also used in RNA, and then another one substitutes in. We would really like to know, do we have these bases, A, G, T, C, and U in Bennu? Did we go one step up that chain from the basic molecules to something interesting? And I'll just show you what some of our data looks like. This is a LCMS, liquid chromatography mass spectrometry trace. Here we can see one of the bases of the genetic code, thymine. So the top is the asteroid sample. The middle one is our blank. We always make sure whenever we process this material, we process an empty container along just in case anything from the laboratory contaminates it. This allows you to provide confidence that what you're seeing is coming from the asteroid. And sure enough, we have thymine and we have some other compounds there. You can see some peaks that are not in the standard. So we do have one of the bases. As we move forward, we can see we're able to identify non-standard bases like methyl uracil. We do have uracil, which is the U in the genetic code. We have the cytosine. We have the guanine, and we have the adenine. They're all there. All the letters of the genetic code were written down 4.5 billion years ago in this asteroid. And these have been waiting that whole time to get into our laboratories to reveal these secrets to us. So absolutely, we have the purines, the pyrimidines, the purines, the nucleobases are coming from this asteroid. Thank you. That gets us partway to genetics. But as we mentioned, the workhorses of biology are the proteins. The genetic code takes the message from the gene and turns it into a protein through ribosome. There's 20 amino acids that are commonly used in biology. You can see them laid out here. They have different characteristics. 14 of them have been detected in the Bennu samples so far. You can see the ones outlined in green there. All of the basic ones that we think were early incorporated into life. We're missing some key ones. You'll see with the red lines through them. Tryptophan hasn't been detected in the asteroid sample yet. Arginine, histidine, lysine, cysteine, and glutamine are missing right now. It's a pretty good set, though. In addition, there's 17 other amino acids that are not used in proteins that we've detected in the sample as well. So we're getting up that chain, right? We're going up from, yes, the basic molecules are there. We see water, we see ammonia, we see hydrocarbons, we see sulfides, we see phosphates. Something's happening in the asteroid. You're getting nucleobases, you're getting amino acids. The basic building blocks of life are showing up in these samples. What about the lipids, or even the membranes? Here's another one of those small particles. This is the same one that was outgassing all those polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. We put it under a microscope to take a look at it. Over there on the left is just your standard reflected light image. See, it's a really tiny particle. There's some bright stuff. Those are the sulfides. The sulfide, you might be familiar with sulfides as pyrite. It's very similar to the minerals that we see here. It's also called fool's gold, so it kind of looks metallic. And when you shine the light on it, it reflects back very brightly, so we can go and find the sulfides there. But the really interesting information comes over on the right there when we scan it with ultraviolet, and we see fluorescence. There's the blue things that are fluorescing. Those are the carbonates and the phosphate minerals. But it's the yellow ones that really got our attention. There's a lot of these little yellow fluorescent dots that we're seeing inside the sample. What are those? Turns out that they're nanoglobules. And I'll show you what that means here. I got some nice data on these. So we can use the fluorescence to go in and find them. We can go onto our scanning electron microscope and we can start to characterize them. We can use our ion microprobe to map their chemical composition. So right away we see that they're kind of spherical or circular in this view, and that they're highly enriched in carbon. One interesting side note, and we don't know exactly what this means yet, as soon as you go in with the electron beam, the fluorescence quenches and goes away, and it's no longer a fluorescent molecule. That's interesting. Just from understanding the geology of the asteroid, that means these things never got really hot. And they look like kind of oil droplets in the sample. We went on now to the transmission electron microscope. And you can see that these things really have some compelling structures. They've got a double wall around them, and they've got a void space in their interior. Sometimes they're filled with liquid. Sometimes they've got mineral. Sometimes they're solid. This one, I'm looking at this thing. Here's two nanoglobules that are kind of welded together. We're over on the right there. We have a chemical map. So wherever you see red, that's where the carbon is. Wherever you see green, that's where silicon is, like those clay minerals. You can see the fibrous forms of the serpentines all around it. And wherever you have the blue, that's iron. That's probably an iron oxide mineral called magnetite there. So in this case, the nanoglobule looks like it encapsulated some of those clay minerals. Clays are interesting because they can also play an important role in organic selection or maybe even in synthesis. And when I look at this one looks like it's going through cell division, kind of, right? I mean, these things look like little protocells. So we do have an indication that compartmentalization is taking place. We can go in with the electron beam, look at the emitted X-rays, and get a sense of the chemical composition. So you can see these things are mostly carbon. We can't measure hydrogen with this system, so we don't know the hydrogen abundance. Mostly carbon, 82 carbons, so we normalized it to 100, 12 oxygens, 5 nitrogens, and 1 sulfur to make up this chemical composition here. So it looks like, along our diagram, the asteroid got us pretty far. We've got the basic molecules. We've got all the prebiotic molecules. It even looks like we're having something that looks like membranes. Compartmentalization is taking place. So the real challenge now is the final steps. Okay, how do you make a nucleic acid? You need to take the nucleobase, attach a sugar, attach a phosphate, and then link those up into chains, and then you have something like an RNA or a DNA. You need to take the amino acids, and you need to link them up into chains to make proteins. So the polymerization, the attraction of these molecules to each other is missing. These are the fundamental stumbling blocks to origin of life right now. We can get pretty far down the path. And then, of course, what happens for all of that to be alive, right? This goes beyond chemistry. I think we all feel that. So I started casting around a couple years ago for some ideas because I just felt like the materialistic view was missing something. Something wasn't there. And I had this idea, maybe it's consciousness. Maybe something about my mental state, my processes, is reflected at a more primitive level and was the driving force, the things that made these things want to join up together and make something that's alive. And I started scanning the literature for all different models of the origin of life, and I came across a paper written by this guy, Stuart Hameroff, Quantum Origin of Life. And I was like, ooh, interesting. I haven't heard about a quantum origin of life. And I loved this paper. I just spent days and days. You can talk to Kate, my wife. I would run over to her with something circled or highlighted. And what I really liked about the model that Stuart put forward, and building on his work with Sir Roger Penrose, was that it gave me molecules to look for and chemicals to test. All the other models of consciousness I couldn't work with. There was nothing for me to say, okay, I'm a chemist. I'm a pretty simple guy in this community. I like rocks. I can hold them in my hand. I can touch them and convince myself they're real. They seem like they've been around for a long, long time. And Stewart's work had lots of very testable ideas. And that's what I was looking for. What can I test with the sample? I spent 20 years, $1 billion of US taxpayer money. Thank you very much for that. I needed something that the sample could inform. And so I said, well, he's talking about processes that are pretty advanced with most of his theory, right? He's looking at neurons. He's looking at these protein structures in neurons called microtubules. You might have heard him talk about those. And they're built up of these components called tubulin. There's two versions of the tubulin, alpha and beta, so they form this dimer, and then they link up into these tubular structures. And he said the components of this that are critical to the quantum process are the aromatic amino acids that have ring molecules attached to them. They kind of come in two flavors. There's the two that are over on the left there, the phenylalanine and the tyrosine. They both have a single benzene ring, that six-sided hexagonal ring attached to them. And then there's this tryptophan, which is really different. It's got the indole ring, a double ring, a six-sided ring and a five-sided ring attached to it. And one of the things right away that made me think he's onto something is I recognized that structure. And I was like, that looks like the core of all the psychedelic molecules. And we have no idea how these things work, but they enter your body. So I've been told, introduce a profound change in your state of consciousness. And then they leave, pretty much unaltered, right? So I was like, okay, I can test for that. And in fact, one of the things I told the team early on was, we're going to develop an analytical protocol for all 20 amino acids that are used in biology. This hadn't been done before because the meteorites are generally contaminated with these things, and it just wasn't worth our time. And you saw we had other amino acids that are not used in biology, and we've mostly focused on those with our meteorite studies because we're confident those are coming from outer space and not from biological contamination. The beauty of the Bennu samples is we don't have to worry about the terrestrial contamination. We know these things are pristine. We've been in control of them since we grabbed them off the surface of that asteroid. When we look at comparing it to that chart, we have phenylalanine. We might have tyrosine. This is really fresh data, in fact, just presented last week. Tyrosine is tentative right now. We're going to go after it in more detail. We've been working with kind of small masses to start, but I just approved almost 7 grams out of the 121 grams to be released to the organic analysts, so they're going to tell us with higher confidence whether the tyrosine is there. And it's pretty similar to phenylalanine. You can see it only differs by that OH that's in the lower left portion of it there. And there's no tryptophan in the Bennu samples. So I started working with an amazing graduate student, Salsan Webby. She's here in the audience. And kind of feeding her some of these crazy ideas to start to go and test. And she's been looking at trying to understand what were the earliest proteins that were used by life on Earth. This was another great moment. I remember reading Stewart's paper, and I was like, I got to meet this guy. Where is he? And I was like, he's here in Tucson? He's literally right across the street. And I went to the Astrobiology Science Conference a couple years ago, and I was looking through the program, and I saw this topic. I was like, this is exactly the person I need to talk to. I went to Salsan's poster, and there was the giant Arizona Block A at the top. I was like, you're at University of Arizona as well? This is great. It's like the universe is bringing us all together for a reason here. So she's looking at protein domains, which are not whole proteins, but they're parts of a protein sequence that can function, evolve, and exist independently of the protein chain. They usually have some specific function, like a particular structure that would be useful across multiple different proteins. So it's a way of getting deeper insight and driving back into the ancient past about what the protein composition of these early organisms might look back. There's a paper that she just posted on bioRxiv. The reference is down there at the bottom. She's identified protein domains that go back to what we call LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. And she's even pushed earlier to what we call pre-LUCA, the ecology or the ecosystem that existed before the life forms that we are all clearly descended from. She's confirmed the notion that tryptophan was the last amino acid added to the genetic code. And she's shown that pre-LUCA is depleted in tyrosine and tryptophan and enriched in phenylalanine. This is pretty consistent with the amino acid composition that we're finding in the Bennu samples. And in fact, I think the final paper of her thesis will be comparing these results directly once we have a lot more confidence and more data in exactly what's inside the asteroid material. LUCA is depleted in tyrosine, tryptophan, and phenylalanine. That's a surprise that phenylalanine shifted a little bit there. And tryptophan is common in the oldest pre-LUCA sequences relative to an extreme depletion in LUCA. So it seems like maybe it was available early, but then it was lost for some reason. When we look at the tubulin, and you go to the evolutionary diagrams, there's a nice paper by Ludenia that says, okay, the ancestor of tubulin is called FTSZ. And this is what bacteria use to undergo cell division. They don't have a cytoskeleton. They don't have a centriole. They don't have these microtubules that grab the chromosomes and separate them apart. They just have this much more primitive filamentary protein. And I presented this 2 years ago at the Science of Consciousness conference. FTSZ does not have any tryptophan in it, and it's enriched in phenylalanine. So the ancestors of the microtubules did not have tryptophan. And this is work Salsan's pursuing right now, and this is really exciting. So she's looking at the evolution of the genetic code, and she's shown that aerobic organisms, those are organisms that undergo respiration, have high levels of tryptophan in their proteins compared to anaerobic organisms, those that don't need oxygenated environments. Tryptophan-specific proteins emerged relatively recently in ancient archaea. This is one of the branches of life. You have bacteria, you have archaea, and you have eukarya. And the incorporation of tryptophan corresponds with the development of photosynthesis and the rise of oxygen in the atmosphere. So it looks like you had these archaea. They were exposed to high levels of abiotically synthesized tryptophan. They incorporated it into their genetic code because tryptophan's an antioxidant, and it would help these organisms deal with this poisonous oxygen gas that these cyanobacteria were emitting into the atmosphere. And then later, they transferred that to the bacterial communities. So this is really important because the rise of oxygen correlates with the development of the eukaryotic cell. You can see a prokaryotic cell there in the lower right, very simple, just has a single strand of DNA, doesn't use tubulin or microtubules, it uses the FTSZ protein, and then you get tryptophan introduced into the system, and you get this microtubule network with the centriole and the cytoskeleton, and a much more complicated cellular structure. You have organelles, you have mitochondria, the genetic materials in chromosomes inside a nuclear cell. So we're putting forward this, what we call bold model for origin of life, consciousness first, which suggests that consciousness preceded life and provided the motivation for molecular self-organization. Carbonaceous asteroids delivered simple aromatic amino acids like phenylalanine and tyrosine, which were incorporated early in life. These prokaryotic organisms had a basic cell structure, and if, following the Penrose-Hameroff idea, a primitive form of consciousness. Photosynthesis was invented, and oxygen rose in the atmosphere, and life incorporated tryptophan to deal with oxidative stress, leading to a rise in the level of consciousness, the tubulin, the microtubules, the eukaryotic cell. Ultimately, that went on to form multicellular life, the nervous system, the brains, and the rich conscious experience enjoyed by some humans on Earth today. Thank you so much.
Okay.
This is okay. Thank you for that. As an iron chemist, I have to ask about my favorite element, and its redox state in the Bennu material.
Sure. So iron.
Yeah.
Yeah, iron is really important, and it's showing up in a range of oxidation states. There's small amounts of reduced iron. We're seeing some phosphide minerals and some rare metallic grains. It's mostly in the sulfides as +2, And then we're seeing iron oxides magnetite, which has a mixed valence state of +2 and +3. So iron actually exists in all three oxidation states in different mineral components. We haven't looked for iron in the organic relationships yet.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Here.
Hi, yes, Vikas O'Reilly Shah, University of Washington. You did mention carbohydrates
Yes.
as part of the backbone, but it was notably absent from your analyses so far. I assume that that's something you're looking for, and
We
where
are,
you at with
yeah.
that?
We're looking for the ribose. We're looking for the deoxyribose, which are the sugars that are used in RNA and DNA, and lots of other sugar compounds as well. We're not there yet. It's still early days. I mentioned we just approved the release of about 7 grams of material, and that's mostly dedicated to the organic analyses. And I did post the OSIRIS-REx sample analysis plan on arXiv. It's about a 300-page document. So you can download it and you can go through and see all the different analytical techniques that we have planned. And I will note we released the sample catalog in March, and NASA will start accepting requests from researchers all over the world. It's kind of like a public library of asteroid material. You'll have to go through a review to prove that you're legitimate and you know how to handle the material and you have a lab that can do the analysis you propose. But we want this material out there. If you have a laboratory and you think you could do something important with this material, please apply to receive some of the Bennu material for your own studies.
Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic talk. Do you have any hypothesis why the basic amino acids are missing on the Bennu sample or in the Bennu sample? Because anyway, basic patches actually in proteins are required to bind RNA. So could this all wind down into hypothesis of, or actually some evidence into the RNA world hypothesis where RNA then emerged on Earth in
Right.
some kind of primordial soup, and then you needed to create proteins binding and interacting with RNA so that they came later on?
Yeah, the hypotheses are nascent right now because the data are just coming out about what amino acids are present or not. And what we're doing is, first of all, we want to make sure we can constrain the fluid compositions well. And one of the graduate students at the University of Arizona has found fluid inclusions in the sulfides. So we postulated just based on their morphology and their appearance that they were growing from the fluid unconstrained. And we've now found little compartments of the liquid trapped inside the crystal structure. So we're able to see what the fluid was that the sulfide minerals precipitated from. I expect they're probably in the carbonates and phosphates as well. So we want to understand the environment. And then we're doing high precision chemical equilibrium and disequilibrium calculations, and we're going to incorporate the thermodynamic properties of all the amino acids to try to understand what are the amino acid distribution telling us, and is it consistent with the fluid composition we're inferring from the mineralogy? So I don't have a specific hypothesis yet for why some are missing and why some are present, but we do have both a chemical, analytical, and a computational approach to addressing that and trying to understand what's there. And we might find them as we go to lower concentrations. They might be there, just not at the detection limits of the small material we've looked at so far.
Okay, thank you. Fantastic.
Sure. Yes.
Oh, Dante, thank you so much for such a stellar project and presentation. It was just wonderful. Sorry to be a bit of a party pooper here.
It's okay.
What are there any features that you selected Bennu for? And is there anything in the sample that you have found that tell us that Bennu didn't come from Earth itself originally? In other words, you give the story of it and
Yes.
talk about collisions, and well, couldn't it just been bumped off the Earth and then came home again?
Yeah.
So
That's not party pooping. That's a good question.
okay, fair enough.
So, absolutely. So I obviously could not present all the data that we've collected so far. There is a paper I put on arXiv just last week that's the first look results. And one way that we characterize extraterrestrial materials is oxygen isotopes. Oxygen has 3 stable isotopes, 16, 17, and 18. And it forms a nice map. And Earth and Moon form a single line that's slope 1/2 because of the kinetic isotope effect. And then Mars is very distinct. We have some meteorites that we're confident are from Mars. Other asteroids are very different. And Bennu plots off the Earth-Moon line. So it doesn't have the same oxygen isotope composition. It also doesn't have the same carbon isotope or nitrogen isotope composition. So those are really strong clues that didn't come from the Earth. The other one is we have those pre-solar grains. So we actually have grains that formed in the outflows of supernova and giant stars as they're shedding their outer layers and dumping their material into space. And those are really reduced compounds like silicon carbides that would not be stable on the surface of the Earth. And they have crazy isotopic ratios, like 1,000 times enrichments in some of the isotopes compared to the Earth. So there would be really no way to imagine launching something like Bennu off of the Earth and having grains that formed around other stars and clearly spent some time in the interstellar medium. So we have really good signatures that Bennu is something primordial. We haven't got to the geochronology, the dating of the rocks yet, but I fully expect that they'll be consistent with meteorites and be about 4.5 billion years old, much older than the Earth itself.
Which is mind-boggling. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thanks for this amazing talk and amazing work. It seems almost magical.
It sure does.
I was curious about, I was really so many interesting things, but a couple of super interesting things were like seeing those things that looked like cell division, those chambers and membranes.
Yeah.
And also the formation of the serpentine, which I know from reading about geology is something that happens at the ocean floors. And so what I was curious about is you said this Bennu came off of a much larger meteor or asteroid, and you said it probably came off when there was a big impact and that kind of disintegrated that bigger meteor. So I was wondering, those features like the cell-like structures and the serpentine that took more dynamic processes to form, do you think they formed before or after that impact that disintegrated the bigger asteroid?
Everything's pointing towards the fact that Bennu's parent, that 200-kilometer object, was an ocean world. That it was very similar environment that we talked about at the floor of the ocean where the mantle hits the ocean water and the serpentine minerals form. So I'm envisioning something like Enceladus, icy crust, rocky interior, and you have an ocean rock interface, and you're forming all these compounds. We've been studying the serpentinites from the mid-ocean ridge as comparative samples, and there's a lot of similarities chemically, structurally, mineralogically, and the relationships between those phases. So I think that was Bennu's parent, and then that all settled down, like the radioactivity died away, and it all kind of froze into its state, and it probably wandered the solar system for a couple billion years, had to migrate in from that Saturnian region into the main asteroid belt, where it was then shattered, and Bennu formed on the order of 1 billion years ago.
So the Bennu didn't form by accretion of smaller things. It was like a chunk that split out, that thing where those things were fossilized.
Yeah, right. Bennu is a series of fragments from a giant collision between two much larger asteroids.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yes?
Hi, thank you so much. As a physicist, I found myself really compelled by the story of how you got there, the orbiting and
Right.
So could you, first of all, are those animations available for the public?
Yes. Yeah, so there's the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center produced all those animations. Everything we produce is public domain, so you're free to use them in your own products. Just please credit NASA. And Goddard has a server, the Science Visualization Server. So if you just search Goddard SVS, you'll find all those animations. And if you're having trouble, just let me know.
Okay, and then how fast was the lander descending on the surface?
To the asteroid?
Yeah, it was
about 10 centimeters per second, so kind of like a beetle crawling, kind of, really approaching it. We're in a microgravity environment. It's such a small body that the gravitational acceleration is about the same as the astronauts experience on the International Space Station. They look like they're in free flow, but there is a small gravitational acceleration, and that's what, it's more like scuba diving than orbiting or moving around. You can really change your orientation relative to the asteroid with small bursts from the rocket engines.
18-minute delay, did you say?
It was 18 minutes during sampling, yeah. We were on the other side of the sun when Bennu was out a little farther than Mars is, or almost to Mars.
And what was the feeling when it escaped for you?
Well, there was still uncertainty because we were only getting really low data rates, 40 bits per second when we were doing the sampling event. So I had to stay up until 2 in the morning when we finally got the spacecraft reoriented and started bringing the images down. And when I saw the image of contact with the asteroid surface, that's when I had the elation that, yes, we got the sample and we're going to hopefully bring it home. Awesome. Yeah, it was amazing. The whole journey's been amazing, absolutely.
Hi, Dante. Thank you for the fantastic talk. It's been one of my favorite. But question for you. If you think then that consciousness may be driving the evolution of life and driving towards complexity, do you think that that should perhaps change the way that we think about great filter events, like the evolution of eukaryotic cells? Is something like that maybe more inevitable given the right precursors?
That's a good question. Is it inevitable? It seems like the building blocks are, but maybe it might be the detailed timeline and the invention of photosynthesis. How common is that? We don't know. It seems like life would want to take advantage of that. Like the whole ecosystem is now based on photon capture. It's fun to think about. Everything that we know, everything we do, all the molecules in our body would not exist if we didn't catch sunlight and turn it into chemical energy. So we're really just captured sunlight. That's what we are here. Did that happen anywhere else in the universe? That's what astrobiology is all about. And it seems like it should, but we're struggling to find any evidence of it right now. So I don't know, but I'm driven to seek answers to it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, Justin.
Hey, Dante, always good to hear you speak. The question I have is more on the mission overall now that you've gotten to this, not true end stage, but you have the sample back. Is there anything you would have done different back in the design stage or the in-between logistics stage, like a larger tag SAM, different sample site, different mission parameters, anything like that?
Yeah, hindsight's always 20/20, and there were things we wish we had at the asteroid. And this might be engineering details and minutiae the audience doesn't care about, but the big antenna that we used to communicate was fixed to the body of the spacecraft. And it would be really nice if we could have gimbaled that so we could just point it to the Earth without having to reorient the spacecraft. That drove a lot of operational complexity. When we looked at the surface of Bennu, I mentioned that salt and pepper texture. We didn't expect it to be so diverse. And our spectrometers, which were the instruments that detected the minerals and the organics, were very coarse, big pixels, like 20-meter pixels. And so everything was kind of averaged out. I would have put an imaging spectrometer on the spacecraft so I could really see what is the bright one, what is the dark one. We kind of had to infer that through mixing models and things like that. I would have loved a bigger tag SAM, and when Lockheed asked me that same question, what would you do on the next one? And I would say, yeah, make this thing big because we could bring back like kilos of this stuff if we just scaled it up. It seems like the physics should do that, and we were pretty successful with sampling, so I think we could go after a bigger one. And if you're in the audience and we've talked about a commercial version, the sample costs about $8 million a gram. So if we can get about 100 people to buy into that, we could go back to Bennu and get more of this and put it in your private collection. So let me know.
Pass on that.
That's right.
Yes.
Last one?
Well, he was there first.
Okay.
He was there first, and then you.
Let's take these last two.
Okay, hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for this amazing talk. Just a question about the origins of life. I mean, the life you've been mentioning, more than mentioning here, is really based on amino acids, DNA, basically the biology we have on Earth. But then, there's been some work suggesting that life could be based on other molecules completely differently, but still would be life. I mean, that comes back to, what is life, right?
Yep.
So, I don't know, what is your take on that?
Yeah, I think the carbon-based life is probably going to be the most common because carbon is such an abundant element and it makes these really complex molecules. People have talked about silicon-based life, but silicon's hard to get into these kind of structures that are similar. I don't think extraterrestrial life has to have the exact DNA, to RNA, to proteins like we have here on Earth, but it's got to have something similar to it. But I don't know. I mean, that's why we're looking for a second example to kind of answer that. It would be profound either way. If we found life on Mars or even extinct life on Mars, that would help us understand, first of all, origins of life seem to be common, and are they based on similar biochemistry, or can you have a wide range of different chemistries?
Thank you.
Sure. Last question.
I'm struck by the forward pass that you described, and I'm wondering, to have sent this thing with the sample that you spent so much effort to get without any steering mechanism and having it land right where you expected it to land strikes me as amazing. Was there some rationale to not having any steering on
For the
this?
capsule?
For the sample capsule once it left the
Yeah, well, we didn't need it, right? I mean, better is the enemy of good enough in this business. So we could throw it from 60,000 miles and it landed exactly where we wanted it to in the Utah desert. So it worked. So why make it more complex? Because complexity costs money, and it adds risk, quite honestly. So thank you. Before we disperse, just a public service announcement. A few of us have gotten together and we've organized the nascent Tucson Festival of Consciousness. It's going to be Saturday night in downtown Tucson in a nice intimate venue featuring Liquid Bloom, a psychedelic, spiritual, musical entity that I invite all of you to join us in. So it's kind of the after party for the festival, and we hope to see you all there. Well, not all of you because it won't fit in the venue, but most of you. Thank you so much.